Hey, so good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me back. So I was here last November to talk about doing things for the greater glory of God. So I'm back to talk a bit about Magis, which is a related concept. And today's session, in a way, reviews some of what we talked about that Culture Day in November, but also deepens what was discussed through the concept of Magis. So these two very related things I want to talk about, through, again, 3 points. First point that I do want to talk about today, defining what Magis is. What is Magis? Magis is not just about more, but about much. This is about doing that much for the greater glory of God. Right? So we aren't just doing things for the glory of God, we're doing things for the greater glory of God. And we'll talk a bit about that in that first point. The second point would be that Magis invites us to stretch ourselves in a much deeper way, to be magnanimous instead of pusillanimous. Okay? Very big words, and again, we will talk about that in a while. And then lastly, I do want to talk about Magis as entailing that interrogation of disordered attachments. Okay? It challenges us to confront our own biases, to confront what assumptions we have about the way the world works, so that we can more fully commit ourselves to God, to ourselves, and to others. So again, those are the 3 points that I'd like to go through for today's Culture Day. Okay. So first point, what is Magis? A little review from last November. So I touched on this a little bit in talking about the greater glory of God. Magis is a Latin term, literally meaning more. Okay? So if you had to translate it more or mas, it usually is used to describe what best leads to God's deepening God's life in us and in the world. Okay? What best leads to God's deepening God's life in us and in the world. Kung anong mas hihigit pa, if we had to translate that in Tagalog. If we are to live our lives for the greater glory of God, and it's in there. It's not just the glory of God, it's the greater glory of God, ad maiorem, maiorem. Towards that more universal good, towards that common good, we are asked to practice Magis. We are asked to imbibe this charism, this value of Magis. But Magis is not just about being what's more. Because sometimes, often, when people hear mas, or kung ano mas hihigit pa, it becomes about more, just more in terms of numbers, in terms of quantity. But I always want to say, it's not just about that, it's also quality. Okay? Service, solidarity, and sharing is what Magis is about. It's not just simply about the amount of power, the amount of prestige, or the amount of possessions. I also touched on this a little in November, but again, just to repeat, because I think it's worth repeating. It's not just the houses that have been built, but the loving homes that you've created. It's not just the food you've made, not just the hospitality that you've given, but the relationships that you've deepened, that you've strengthened in the work that you do here in Joy-Nostalg. And so all of these things are part of what Magis is. So it's not just about the numbers. It's not just about doing more in terms of burning yourselves out. It's not just about having sleepless nights because you've done all of this work. But again, also the quality. The quality of relationships, the quality of lives that you've helped. So Magis asks us to think about not just what is more, which is the literal translation, but about much. What is that much in your work here in Joy-Nostalg? And that's one of the questions that perhaps I'd like to invite us to think about. Not just what is more, but what is much in your work here in Joy-Nostalg. So that's the first point. Okay, very quickly, I just wanted to define what Magis is and what that means. Okay, a little review from November when I talked a little bit about Magis in relation to Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam. okay, or doing things for the greater glory of God. What I'd like to emphasize also would be my second and third points, the challenges, the implications of saying, okay, if we're going to be Magis or do Magis, what does that mean? What does it mean then to be someone who espouses this value of Magis? And the second point talks about this. So Magis invites us to stretch ourselves in a deeper way. Okay. It invites us to become more magnanimous rather than pusillanimous. They're a mouthful, okay? But they're two actually, one is a virtue, one is a vice, okay? That really asks us to do more, to do better. Okay? So Magis challenges us to move away from being pusillanimous, okay? The vice that is often translated into smallness of soul. Okay? So when one says that one is pusillanimous, this person shies away from the challenges of life. Instead of acknowledging the gifts, okay, one has and striving to cultivate them and put them to good use, the pusillanimous person instead says, everything is too hard, so I'd rather not do anything. Okay. It might look like humility. No? Often the pusillanimous person might say, hindi ko kaya yan eh. Sino ba ako? Parang, I'm not that good. No? So it might look like humility. But we often say, no, it's not really humility. Because in a way, it's not really accepting or even sometimes rejecting that actually we have certain gifts, certain talents that we can use. Okay? And because we don't want to accept that, we don't want to accept how good we actually are, we tend to shy away from these challenges. We tend to shy away and say, no, that's not for me. No, I can't do that. And so the tendency then is for the soul to shrink. That's why Thomas Aquinas, one of the theologians in the Catholic Church, talks about that as smallness of soul. Okay. It might also look like pakikisama. No? Pusillanimity might look like pakikisama. That might actually be fear. No? Hahayaan ko na lang. I don't want to rock the boat. No? Because, again, sino lang ba ako? No? I don't know any of these things, or I'm not good enough to actually pursue that. No, I don't have the education, I don't have the resources, so I'd rather not. No? But again, it's not pakikisama, it's not humility. It becomes the vice of pusillanimity. Thomas Aquinas also calls pusillanimity the child of acedia. So again, if you remember in November, I talked about acedia as a particular vice of apathy, of listlessness, na parang wala akong pake, like just whatever happens, happens. Okay? Aquinas actually calls pusillanimity the child of acedia. Okay? Whereas acedia is about how external things tend to stop people. The tendency is someone who is assiduous, no? We say, well, ang dami kasing nangyari kaya hindi ko nagawa. No, because it's this thing that happened, the external thing happened, and that happened, so it's everyone else's fault but mine. Someone who is pusillanimous then focuses on or refuses to see that giftedness that we might have. No? Someone who's pusillanimous rejects that giftedness. No? Rejects that possibility that maybe I can do it. Maybe I have the gifts for that. And again, it's very easy. No, it's very easy to not have that confidence. It's very easy to just think that I can't do it. Especially if we've never really tried, we've never had that experience, we've never really done something like that before. Okay? And so it's easy to slip into that vice of pusillanimity. So instead, the focus becomes how everything is too hard. Marriage is too hard. Work is too hard. Whatever I'm being asked to do, too hard. Too much. It's too much of a challenge. All those saintly things that they ask for, all those things that we're asked to do our best, too hard, so I'd rather not try. I'd rather not do it. Okay, so pusillanimity then makes us shy away from those challenges. Okay, we then tend to move away from that instead of rising to the occasion. So instead, Magis invites us to be magnanimous. Okay? So if pusillanimity is the vice, magnanimity is the virtue. You're asked to be magnanimous. It's not just about being generous. No, in the average person's vocabulary, often when we say that someone is magnanimous, it's often related to generosity. No, someone who's able to take the moral high ground. Someone who's able to give. No, in a way to give without counting the cost. Usually, that's what people think of when they hear the word magnanimous. But I do want to highlight, it's not just about being generous. Okay. Magnanimity is the virtue, okay, translated as the opposite of smallness of soul. It's the greatness of one's soul. That we are willing to see, to use, what God has given us, okay, to do great things. Okay. That we acknowledge. Again, it's not just about saying we don't have we don't want to show our gifts, for fear of being called mayabang or for fear of being called that you're just showing off. No? But again, we're not talking about pride here. We're talking about a realistic acknowledgement of the gifts that we have. Acknowledging that we have certain things, certain talents that we can use. Willing to use that. Willing to use what God has given us to do great things. To rise to the challenge of doing what is right and what is just. So again, acknowledging that, taking a deep, long, hard look at ourselves, taking the time to really think about what are the things I can do, and how might that now help answer the world's hungers? How might that now help rise to the occasion of the many challenges that our work has, our relationships have, and the world around us has. How might we now answer the challenge to deepen God's life in ourselves, in our relationships, and in the world? And again, that's one of the invitations that Magis wants us to consider. How do we be more magnanimous in the world rather than pusillanimous? Magis and magnanimity thus challenges us to choose the more loving and just option, allowing us to recognize God's call and to respond to it. Because once we realize then, we do have certain gifts, that we can do certain things, then there is that magnanimity, that confidence to also recognize that perhaps we are also being called to greater things. That these greater calls are not just for people who we think are holy or who we think are excellent, but that we too can be excellent, that we too can be Magis, that we too can do things for the greater glory of God. And that call again is for everyone, not just for the select few, and that we then have an idea of how we might respond to it in our own particular context. And that's a big challenge of Magis. How might we do that much given a realistic understanding of the self? That understanding of what we have, what do we bring to the table? So again, that's the second point. That Magis invites us to be magnanimous rather than pusillanimous. That we are actually being asked or challenged to choose that more loving and just option. We are challenged to hear God's call for us, to actually hear that this call is not just for those we think are great and excellent, but that we too are excellent, that we too have something to offer, and that we too can respond to this call with the particular gifts that we have been given. Lastly, for the third point, this is actually the hardest, I would say. The hardest thing to hear, and the hardest thing to really settle or even make sense of in ourselves, our attachments, or Ignatius of Loyola calls it our disordered attachments. So in order to practice magis, to be magnanimous, it asks us to interrogate ourselves and our disordered attachments. It asks us to actually take that really long, hard look at ourselves. And that's not easy. Often we don't have the time. And it's also not great to look at ourselves and also identify not just the gifts, but also the things that we might have to change. So if the second point talks about like all the gifts that we have, all the graces, all the talents that we can bring to the table and share, this third point also asks us to be realistic and look at ourselves and say, well, what are the things that might be hindering my being magis? What are the things that might be stopping me from making that more loving and just choice? Just a little definition. Disordered attachments in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. So the Jesuit saint. He talks about how disordered attachments are desires that have become obstacles. Obstacles to our becoming our best selves, making it difficult for us to love God and others. Often we might not see it. It can be very difficult to identify because we all have desires. And again, they're not necessarily bad things. What makes it difficult to identify is when it has become disordered. When it has become something that stops us from actually doing the more loving and just option. Disordered attachments keep us from deep listening. We are unable to listen because we hold on to these desires. We only hear what we want to hear. We only do or see what we want to see. So disordered attachments can keep us from deep listening, honest reflection, and taking action. Because we hold on so tightly to these disordered attachments that we fail to reflect on ourselves, that we fail to take action. And this is seen in the story of the rich young man in Matthew 19, verse 16 to 22. Allow me to just go through the story. So in Matthew 19, the story starts. Someone came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, what good thing shall I do so that I may obtain eternal life?" And Jesus says to him, "Why are you asking me about what is good? There is only one who is good, but if you want to enter life, keep the commandments." So what is clearly written in the commandments in the Jewish law. Then the rich young man says to him, "Which ones?" Asks. And Jesus says, "You shall not commit murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony, honor your father and mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So Jesus talks about, in a way, the 10 Commandments. Jesus talks about the Levitical law. This would have been very familiar to his audience. And the young man says to him, "All these I have kept. What am I still lacking?" And in a way, one of the commentaries on the stories would say, like, you can almost hear the smugness in the voice of the rich young man saying, "Yeah, I've done it. Easy. No problem. I've done all of the 10 Commandments. Yeah. So I get to heaven. No problem." And Jesus responds, if you want to be complete, if you really want to say, "What am I still lacking?" Go and sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. And when the young man heard this statement, he went away grieving, for he was one who owned much property. And again, it's not often. This is a way of talking about like what we also need to do in terms of the more. Okay? It's also making sure that we are not too attached, okay, to certain things, okay, in this life. It's asking us to say, okay, yes, there are certain things, okay, there are certain base things, there are certain desires that we might have. Again, it's not about having money, okay, that is wrong here. But the problem becomes when the attachment to that money, to that property, okay, stops the person from doing the more loving option, to doing what is right, to doing what is just. Again, in this statement, no, it's not because the rich man or the young man had a lot of property, but it was the attachment. The very strong disordered attachment to that property that made it difficult for him to choose the more loving option, okay, which would have been service, no, solidarity, okay, and sharing those resources that he had. Okay. So for many of these disordered attachments, we might think of money, power, and prestige. Often these are the more common things that might come to mind when we think about what are possible disordered attachments. And of course, these are the more common ones. But even love for friends, love for family, certain things that we might not think of, okay, as disordered attachments, because they're more naturally good things. Okay? Our friends and our family may also become a disordered attachment. They may become an obstacle or an excuse to avoid doing what is right. And again, this is especially difficult, again, as I said, no? This third point is always the hardest to do. Especially for Filipino culture, for example, we're very familial. Very important sa atin yung mga pamilya natin. But sometimes family can also become an obstacle, especially when fights happen, especially when disagreements happen on how things must be done. Even those kinds of relationships, when held on too tightly, can become disordered attachments. Okay? And it's even more difficult, okay, to actually say, this is important, but there's something more important. Again, the emphasis here is disordered. There's something disordered. We all have attachments and desires, and by themselves, they are not wrong. Okay? We all have our relationships with our friends, our family, our significant others. We all have our property. We all have our resources. Again, those are all things that we all need, we all want. And those by themselves are not wrong. But the worry is if they become disordered attachments, again, that they become the priority at the expense of others, at the expense of the self, at the expense of what is more loving and what is more just. And often I emphasize this third point. I spend a bit more time and I end with this point so that there's time to kind of think about this third point, because it's the hardest thing to hear. It's the hardest thing to tell ourselves. One of the things that makes it difficult, again, is because we don't like to hear the bad things about ourselves. But it's important to also recognize. I'll end with one story just to talk about like what disordered attachments are and how they might look like. Okay? So in my case, one of the things that I had to do was choose where to take my doctorate. As a professor in Ateneo, we are expected to take a doctorate. There was a push to go abroad, so I was applying to Fordham University and KU Leuven in Belgium. Okay. So I got accepted to both. Okay. And when I was making that decision, trying to weigh, okay, where do I go? Of course, everyone was saying, go to Leuven, go to Belgium. Okay. That university is in the top 5 universities in my field. If you're smart, if you like go there, like you'll gain all the connections, you'll learn everything. You'll be really among the celebrated theologians or the celebrated people in my field. And so part of me is like, okay, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I should go to Belgium. I'll learn a lot from them, and the funding was also generous, so they would pay for my time there. But there was also a part of me that really wanted to go to Fordham. Fordham University is a Jesuit school. There were also a lot of exciting conversations happening there in my field, and I really wanted to work with that particular faculty member there. Okay. But I was telling myself, no, I should go to Leuven. It sounds better, and I would really be there with everyone who's cool who is cool in theology, who is probably not cool anywhere else, but who is cool in my discipline. Okay. But I was talking, before I made my decision, I was talking to one of my colleagues in the department. And when he was listening to me talk about both options, he was saying, okay, you sound like you really want to go to Fordham. You sound like it's more what you want to do, and what is more life-giving and loving is going to Fordham. Okay. So why are you still tied to going to Belgium? And so thankfully, he is a good friend, so he could tell me things, and I wouldn't get offended. And he told me point blank, Steph, there's a disordered attachment at work here, and your disordered attachment is prestige. Okay, that I was too attached to the name of Leuven, to the name of that university, because then I would be with the cool people. I would be known as a great theologian if I went there, even though I would learn much more, even though it would be a more loving option to go to Fordham and to deepen God's life in me and to bring back all of those things that I would have learned at Fordham. Okay. And that was hard to hear. But because of that relationship I had with that person, it was also something for me to reflect on. Prestige was one of the disordered attachments that I had. Part of who I was, part of my upbringing in a Chinese family, part of how I was raised, in a way reflected why prestige was so important. But then it became a stumbling block. That it became a way for me to actually say, no, like, I was going to say no to the more loving option, okay, because I was chasing that prestige. And so I mentioned this story again because it's not often it's not obvious. I give those choices because both choices are good. Like there wasn't an obviously bad choice. There also wasn't an obvious disordered attachment. Because everyone would be like, yeah, it's fine. Like either university would have been fine. Like you would have learned from either university. You would have grown in either university. But taking the time to reflect, taking the time to think about, again, who we are, our gifts, but also what our desires are, our attachments, would be helpful for us to identify, are there things that are becoming disordered attachments? Are there things that are becoming obstacles to my doing what is best, what is magis? Are there things that I could have done, but stopped myself because I was pusillanimous, because there was something that I was holding on to very tightly. And so I end the third point there, and to reflect on those disordered attachments. Okay, so again, just to recap, this is very Jesuit pedagogy. Always repeat what you said. Again, the first thing that I wanted us to know, what is Magis? Okay. That Magis is not just about more or mas, kung ano yung mas hihigit pa, but about much. About much, okay? About the relationships, okay? The relationships that you foster here in Joy-Nostalg, not just with each other, but in the products and services that you give. Okay? All for the greater glory of God. Now again, not just for the glory of God, but for that greater glory of God, kung ano ang mas hihigit pa. Second, that Magis challenges us to stretch ourselves in a deeper way, to be magnanimous instead of pusillanimous. Now again, I always talk about magnanimity, that we are invited to be more magnanimous. That instead of pusillanimity, instead of acedia, that we become more magnanimous. And then lastly, that Magis entails interrogating our disordered attachments. So again, we all have these desires. Have any of them now become excuses for me not to do the good that I can do, for me not to do my best? Okay. So that we interrogate these disordered attachments so that we can more fully commit ourselves to God, ourselves, and others. So again, these 3 points I'd like us to reflect on and to more deeply think about, especially for ourselves. Okay. So with that, I would like to end. I want to give more time for reflection, not just me talking, and I hope you have a good Culture Day ahead.